Once, in a realm blessed with rivers of silver and mountains rich in gemstones, there ruled a king named Erwin. His palace, nestled atop a high hill, overlooked the kingdom like a golden eye, for it was said that everything within its walls shimmered with wealth. Gold lined the ceilings, silver chandeliers cast their glow, and the floors sparkled with inlaid gemstones. Yet for all his riches, King Erwin was a man tormented by a hunger that could not be sated, a hunger for more. The king's obsession with wealth began in his youth. As a boy, he would sit in his father's treasury for hours, running his hands through piles of coins, fascinated by their cold, metallic gleam. While other children dreamed of adventure, Erwin dreamed of treasure chests overflowing with gold. When he ascended the throne, he vowed to make his kingdom the wealthiest in the world. Under his rule, the kingdom prospered at first. The mines yielded precious metals, and trade routes brought exotic goods from distant lands. But the king's greed soon turned his blessing into a curse. He imposed crushing taxes on his people, demanding payment not in grain or goods, but in gold. Farmers were forced to sell their land, merchants to part with their wares for a fraction of their worth. The wealth flowed upward, filling the king's coffers, while his subjects grew poorer with each passing year. King Erwin took pride in his treasury, a cavernous vault hidden deep beneath the palace. It was said to contain more gold than any mortal could spend in 1,000 lifetimes. But to Erwin, it was never enough. He spent his days pacing the vault, counting and recounting the coins, his fingers trembling with the need for more. "A king is measured by his wealth," he often said, ignoring the empty streets and barren fields beyond his palace walls. The once thriving kingdom began to wither. Villages that had flourished for generations were abandoned as their inhabitants fled the king's greed. The rivers, once teeming with fish, ran dry as their waters were diverted to wash gold from the mines. The forests were stripped bare to fuel the forges, leaving the land scarred and lifeless. Yet King Erwin remained blind to the suffering around him. One day, a group of villagers gathered at the palace gates, their faces gaunt and their clothes threadbare. They begged the king for mercy, pleading for relief from the taxes that had left them destitute. But Erwin, seated on his golden throne, dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "Do you think I built this kingdom on kindness?" he sneered. "Hard work and sacrifice are the price of greatness. If you cannot pay, then you do not belong in my kingdom." The villagers left, their hope crushed, and the king returned to his treasury, his mind already calculating how to extract more wealth from his dying land. His advisors, once wise and loyal, had long since learned to keep their objections to themselves. Those who dared to speak against the king were exiled or imprisoned, their voices silenced by the weight of his ambition. But as the years passed, even the king began to feel the emptiness of his pursuits. His gold brought him no joy, his throne no comfort. He dreamed of endless treasure, but awoke each morning with a gnawing sense of dissatisfaction. One stormy night, as the wind howled through the palace and lightning illuminated its golden walls, King Erwin sat alone in the grand hall. Before him lay a feast untouched, the finest food and wine wasted on a man who found no pleasure in them. He muttered to himself, his voice echoing in the empty chamber, "It is not enough. It will never be enough." At that moment, a knock echoed through the hall, sharp and deliberate. The king frowned, for no visitor had been announced, and few dared to disturb him. "Enter," he commanded, his voice sharp and impatient. The grand doors creaked open, and a figure cloaked in shadow stepped into the room. The figure stepped into the golden hall, their presence both unsettling and mesmerizing. They were cloaked in a dark, flowing robe that seemed to drink in the light of the room, creating a stark contrast to the shimmering gold surrounding them. The air grew heavy, as if the palace itself held its breath. King Erwin sat upright on his throne, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Who dares enter my hall unannounced?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "Guards!" But the guards did not move. They stood frozen, their faces blank, their spears lowered as if the stranger's presence had drained them of all will. The king's unease deepened, but he masked it with anger. Speak! Erwin barked, his fingers gripping the arms of his throne. The stranger lowered their hood, revealing a face that was neither old nor young, neither male nor female. Their features seemed to shift in the flickering candlelight, as though they were made of shadow and smoke. When they spoke, their voice was soft, yet commanding, like the whisper of the wind through the trees. "Your Majesty," the stranger began, bowing low, "I come bearing a gift, a solution to the emptiness that plagues your soul." The king stiffened. "I am the wealthiest man in the world," he said coldly. "What could you possibly offer me that I do not already possess?" The stranger's lips curved into a faint smile. "Wealth beyond imagining, the power to transform your kingdom into a land of pure gold. Imagine it, Your Majesty. Every stone, every tree, every blade of grass shining with the brilliance of your wealth. You would not merely be the richest king in the world, you would be a legend, a god among men." The words struck a chord deep within the king's heart. The idea of a kingdom entirely made of gold was intoxicating. His fingers itched with the thought of such power, his mind racing with possibilities. Yet a flicker of suspicion remained. "And what do you gain from this?" Erwin asked, his voice laced with distrust. The stranger tilted their head, as though amused by the question. "I require only a small price, a token of your commitment, a single drop of your blood, and a fragment of your soul. In exchange, I shall grant you the golden touch. Everything you lay your hands upon will transform into the treasure you desire most." Erwin hesitated, the flicker of suspicion warring with the roaring flames of his greed. A fragment of his soul? What did a soul matter when compared to the glory of eternal wealth? He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the golden chandeliers, the gleaming floors. It was beautiful, yes, but it was not enough. It would never be enough. "Do it," he said at last, his voice steady with determination. "Give me this power." The stranger's smile widened, their eyes glinting like the edge of a blade. "As you wish." From within their cloak they drew a small dagger, its blade black as night, and etched with strange, glowing runes. The stranger approached the throne with deliberate steps, and though the king's instincts screamed at him to recoil, he remained seated, his pride holding him in place. The stranger took the king's hand, their touch cold as ice, and pricked his finger with the dagger. A single drop of blood welled up and fell onto a coin the stranger held in their other hand. As the blood touched the coin, it sizzled and glowed, the light spreading outward like veins of molten gold. The air around them shimmered, and a strange, resonant hum filled the hall. The king felt a surge of energy course through his veins, as though he were being filled with liquid fire. His hands tingled, and his vision swam with golden light. "It is done," the stranger said, stepping back. Their voice now carried an otherworldly echo, as though they spoke from both near and far. "The power is yours. Use it wisely, for the golden touch is a gift that can build or destroy." Before the king could respond, the stranger turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving no trace of their presence. For a moment, the king sat in silence, staring at his hand. He reached out hesitantly and touched the arm of his throne. Instantly, the already golden surface transformed, deepening in hue, its intricate carvings glowing with newfound brilliance. A laugh burst from his lips, loud and triumphant. "At last," he whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. "At last, I am truly the master of gold." He stood, his hunger ignited anew, and began to touch everything within reach. Goblets, tables, even the tapestries lining the walls, all transformed into pure, gleaming gold. The king roamed his palace, his laughter echoing in the empty halls as he reveled in his newfound power. But outside, the storm raged on, and the shadows seemed to linger just a little longer than before. For the first few hours, King Erwin was drunk with joy. He wandered the palace, touching everything in sight, transforming his already opulent home into a realm of unmatched splendor. Marble columns turned to pure gold with a single brush of his fingers. Velvet drapes stiffened and gleamed as golden sheets. The very air seemed to hum with the energy of his newfound power. The king could not contain his elation. He summoned his attendants to witness his transformation of the palace. "Behold," he declared, his voice echoing through the grand hall, "your king is no longer a mere man. I have become a god, with the power to shape the world as I see fit." But the attendants, who had grown wary of his ever-growing greed, exchanged uneasy glances. They bowed in silence, careful not to meet his gaze for too long. They feared this new power, for it seemed to amplify the very hunger that had already brought the kingdom to its knees. As the night deepened, Erwin returned to the grand dining hall, where a feast had been laid out in his honor. The long table was adorned with roasted pheasants, fresh bread, golden fruits, and goblets brimming with wine. The aromas wafted through the air, enticing the king after his exhausting spree of transmutations. "Finally," he said to himself, settling into his gilded throne at the head of the table, "a feast fit for a god." He reached for a piece of bread, his hunger gnawing at him. But the moment his fingers touched the loaf, it hardened into solid gold. The crust cracked under the pressure of his grip, revealing an unyielding core of metal. Frowning, he reached for a goblet of wine. As his lips brushed the rim, the liquid within froze, turning into a block of gleaming gold. "What is this?" Erwin muttered, frustration rising in his chest. He tried again, this time tearing into a roasted pheasant. But as soon as his fingers sank into the tender meat, the bird stiffened, its juices crystallizing into golden resin. He threw it aside in disgust. The realization crept over him slowly, like a shadow overtaking the light. Every morsel of food, every drop of drink was now beyond his reach. His curse, no, his gift, had rendered sustenance impossible. Desperation replaced anger. He called for his servants, commanding them to bring more food. They obeyed, trembling under his furious gaze. Platters of fresh dishes were placed before him, but it was all in vain. No matter how delicately he tried to handle the food, no matter how carefully he drank from the goblets, the result was always the same. Erwin's hunger turned savage. He bellowed at his attendants, demanding a solution. "Why does this happen?" he roared. "Find a way to undo this!" But the servants, too frightened to speak, merely backed away. The hall grew eerily silent, save for the king's ragged breathing. His golden hands trembled as he looked around the room, his once grand feast, now a lifeless tableau of gleaming statues. The hours passed, and the king's desperation deepened. He tried eating with utensils, but even the lightest touch of his lips transformed the food. He tried drinking from a ladle, but the wine turned solid before it reached his tongue. The more he struggled, the more futile his efforts became. At last, exhaustion overtook him, and he slumped in his chair, staring at the golden feast with hollow eyes. His stomach churned with hunger, a sharp and relentless reminder of his mortality. "This cannot be," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. This was meant to be a blessing. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling like a chorus of mourners. The king, once triumphant and invincible, now sat alone in his golden palace, his curse beginning to reveal its true nature. But the curse's cruelty was not yet done with him. As the days turned to weeks, Erwin's hunger grew unbearable. He began to avoid the dining hall, unable to face the mockery of the untouched feast. Servants dared not approach him, for those who accidentally brushed against his hand were instantly transformed into statues, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and terror. The once bustling palace became a mausoleum of gold. Where there had been laughter and life, there was now only silence and stillness. And the king, once so proud of his wealth, found himself surrounded by treasures that offered no comfort, no nourishment, and no escape. In his isolation, the king began to understand the full weight of his bargain. He had traded his humanity for a power that could only destroy. The curse of the Golden Touch did not confine itself to King Erwin alone. Its shadow spread beyond the gilded walls of the palace, creeping into every corner of the kingdom. As the king's madness deepened, so too did the suffering of his people. Aurum, once a realm of unparalleled prosperity, was now a land of desolation. The rivers that once carried life through the kingdom had dried to dusty beds, their waters diverted to fuel the mines. The fertile fields, which had fed generations of villagers, lay fallow under a sun that seemed to scorch harder with each passing day. Forests that once echoed with birdsong stood as skeletal remains, their trees stripped bare for timber and fuel. The people, burdened by relentless taxes and the loss of their livelihoods, began to flee. Entire villages were abandoned, their inhabitants taking to the forests and hills in search of safety. Merchants avoided Orum's once thriving markets, for they had nothing to sell and no buyers left to trade with. Those who remained in the kingdom did so out of desperation, their eyes hollow and their spirits broken. Yet King Erwin saw none of this. Consumed by his own misery, he rarely left the palace. When he did venture out, it was to oversee the transport of gold from the mines to his ever-growing treasury. He rode through the streets in a golden carriage, its wheels crushing the cracked stones beneath it, oblivious to the gaunt faces of his subjects. "More gold," he muttered constantly, his once commanding voice reduced to a whisper. "I need more gold." The people, who had once admired their king's ambition, now spoke of him in hushed tones, their words tinged with fear and anger. Some called him the Mad King, others the Golden Tyrant. Rumors began to spread, tales of his cursed touch, of servants turned to statues and feasts left untouched. Many whispered that the king had sold his soul to a demon, and the golden splendor of the palace was merely a facade for the decay within. The palace itself, once a beacon of pride, had become a tomb. Its halls were silent, its servants reduced to golden statues that lined the corridors like grim reminders of the king's folly. Erwin, unable to bear the sight of his own handiwork, ordered the statues moved to the dungeons. There, in the darkness, they stood forgotten, their frozen faces etched with terror. Despite the silence within the palace, the air was thick with tension. The few servants who remained alive lived in constant fear of their master's touch. They crept through the halls like ghosts, careful to avoid the king's gaze. Some whispered of escape, but the gates were locked, and the guards, though few in number, were loyal to the gold that lined their pockets. As the kingdom fell deeper into ruin, the weather seemed to mirror its decline. Storms battered the land, their winds howling through the empty villages. Crops withered under unrelenting heat, and when the rains finally came, they turned the dry earth to mud, washing away what little remained of the harvest. In the midst of this chaos, a rebellion began to stir. Among the exiled villagers, a leader emerged, a young woman named Leora, whose family had been among the first to suffer under the king's greed. Leora had grown up hearing stories of Orum's former glory, and she vowed to restore the kingdom to what it once was. Gathering the displaced and the desperate, she formed a band of rebels. They moved in secret, sabotaging the mines and intercepting shipments of gold. Their message spread like wildfire. The king's greed had destroyed the land, but together they could rebuild it. Word of the rebellion eventually reached the palace, but King Erwin dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Fools," he muttered. "Let them fight over the scraps. It is the gold that matters." But as the rebellion grew stronger, so too did the cracks in the king's rule. His guards, once loyal, began to waver. The treasury, despite its immense wealth, could not buy the loyalty of a starving people. And still, the king sat in his golden palace, surrounded by treasures that brought him no joy, blind to the kingdom crumbling around him. His once proud ambition had become a poison, spreading through the land like a sickness. In his heart, Erwin knew that his empire was dying. But his greed, like the curse that consumed him, would not let him stop. The Golden Palace, once a symbol of Orum's prosperity, had become a prison of solitude. King Erwin sat on his throne, his once regal frame reduced to a gaunt shadow of its former self. The room, bathed in the unnatural glow of its gilded surfaces, felt cold and lifeless despite the riches it contained. Erwin's hands, trembling with hunger and weariness, rested on the arms of his throne. They had become the instruments of his torment, capable of turning anything into gold, but incapable of offering him sustenance or comfort. His touch had once been the envy of kings, but now it was his greatest curse. The halls of the palace were eerily silent. save for the faint echoes of the wind that slipped through cracks in the windows. The servants, once bustling with activity, were gone. Those who hadn't fled the palace had succumbed to the curse, their lifeless forms stored away in the dungeons like forgotten relics. Erwin was alone, entirely and utterly alone. He tried to distract himself by wandering the halls, but every step only reminded him of his isolation. The golden statues of animals and people, created during his first days with the golden touch, now mocked him with their frozen splendor. The faces of the statues seemed to accuse him, their expressions frozen in terror or despair. As the days dragged on, the king began to hear whispers. At first, he dismissed them as the tricks of an overtaxed mind, but the voices grew louder, their tones sharper, until they became impossible to ignore. "Greedy king," they hissed, echoing through the empty corridors. "You hoarded the wealth of the world, and now you have nothing." Erwin clutched his head, his golden fingers pressing against his temples. "Who dares speak to me this way?" he shouted, his voice reverberating through the halls. The whispers answered in unison, a chorus of mocking tones. "We are the souls you have taken, the lives you have destroyed. Your wealth is built on our suffering, and now you shall suffer in kind." The king staggered, his vision swimming as the voices seemed to swirl around him. He recognized some of them, the villagers he had turned away, the servants who had fallen victim to his touch. Their words pierced him like daggers, each one a reminder of his greed and cruelty. "Silence!" he roared, his voice cracking. "I am your king. You have no right." But the voices only laughed, their tones filled with scorn. "King of gold, ruler of ruin, your throne is built on lies, and your kingdom is nothing but ash." Desperate to escape the torment, Erwin fled to the treasury. The cavernous vault, once his sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Piles of gold coins and bars surrounded him, their brilliance a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt inside. Falling to his knees, he clawed at the coins, his golden hands creating a hollow clinking sound. "This is all I have," he muttered, his voice trembling. "This is all I need." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. The gold, for all its beauty and value, could not fill the void within him. It could not soothe his hunger, nor could it silence the voices that haunted him. The storm outside grew fiercer, lightning illuminating the dark corners of the vault. Erwin looked up, his face pale and hollow, as the wind howled through the cracks in the palace walls. For the first time in his life, he felt fear, not of losing his wealth, but of losing himself. He thought of the stranger who had given him the golden touch, their enigmatic smile, and the promise of untold riches. "You did this to me," he whispered, his voice choked with rage and despair. "You cursed me." But even as he said the words, he knew the blame was not entirely theirs. He had accepted the bargain, blinded by his own greed. The power he had craved so desperately had become his undoing. Collapsing onto the golden floor, Erwin wept. His tears, the only thing he could still produce that wasn't gold, fell onto the coins and disappeared among them. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember the days before his obsession had consumed him. He thought of the fields and forests that had once thrived, the laughter of his people, the simple joy of a meal shared with friends. He thought of what he had lost, not to a curse, but to his own insatiable hunger for more. The voices faded, leaving him in silence, but the emptiness remained, heavier than ever, and so the king sat on his lonely throne, surrounded by the treasures that had brought him nothing but ruin. Time in the palace had become a blur. Days, weeks, or perhaps even months passed as King Erwin sat in his golden prison, consumed by his guilt, his regret, and his insatiable hunger. His once vibrant eyes had dulled to lifeless orbs, the fire of ambition long extinguished. His hands, still stained with gold, shook as they reached for anything that might bring relief. But there was nothing left. Outside, the kingdom of Aurum continued to wither. The rebellion led by Leora had grown stronger, their ranks swelling with every passing day. The people, long silenced by fear, had found their voice again. They marched through the desolate lands, tearing down the golden monuments and breaking the chains that had bound them to a king who cared only for his wealth. The rebellion had reached the palace gates. Erwin, now more a shadow than a king, heard the distant rumble of the approaching army. His heart, long dead to the world, gave a faint throb of fear. The sound of the rebellion's march was like the ringing of a bell, tolling the end of his reign. For the first time in years, he stood from his throne, his legs weak beneath him. He stumbled to the balcony that overlooked the courtyard, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Below, he saw the rebels gathered in a great throng, their faces determined, their banners raised high. They had come for him, for the gold that had corrupted everything, for the kingdom he had destroyed with his own hands. A figure stepped forward from the crowd, Leora. She was tall, her face set in a fierce resolve, her eyes filled with the fire of justice. She did not speak, but her gaze met the king's, and for a moment it seemed as though the world stood still. Erwin could feel her stare, as if it were a weight pressing down on him, and he felt the suffocating truth of it. He had not only destroyed his kingdom, he had destroyed the lives of those who had trusted him. The very people who had once revered him now stood before him as judges, and their verdict was clear. He turned away from the balcony, his knees buckling beneath him. The voices that had haunted him returned, louder now, their mockery unrelenting. "Greedy king," they whispered, "you wanted everything, and now you have nothing." He staggered back to his throne, his golden hands gripping the arms of the chair as if they could somehow hold him together. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, his body trembling from the weight of his sins. But even as the rebellion drew closer, even as Leora's forces surrounded the palace, Erwin could not summon the strength to fight. He had long since surrendered to his own despair. The gold, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a shackle, a heavy weight that threatened to crush him. It was then that the stranger appeared once more. This time, they did not enter through the doors or the windows, but materialized before him in the very air itself. Their dark cloaks swirled around them, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. "You!" Erwin gasped, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. "You did this to me." The stranger regarded him with a look that could have been pity or amusement. It was impossible to tell. "Did I?" they asked softly. "You were the one who made the choice, Erwin. You sought power, and I gave it to you. What did you expect, if not this?" Erwin's hands clenched into fists, the golden rings on his fingers digging into his skin. "I was a fool," he whispered. "A fool who thought gold could bring happiness. I thought I could control it." The stranger tilted their head. "You thought gold could control you." The word struck the king like a slap, and he staggered back. He had been so blinded by his own desires, so convinced that wealth could solve every problem, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. The stranger stepped closer, their presence growing more oppressive. "Now you understand, don't you? Gold cannot buy peace. It cannot heal wounds. It cannot restore what has been lost." Erwin's heart ached as he realized the truth. The kingdom was beyond saving, and his people would never forgive him. The gold, the very thing he had coveted, had destroyed everything. He had sacrificed his soul for it, and now it was all for nothing. The stranger extended a hand, their fingers glowing with an ethereal light. "You are free to choose now, King Erwin. Let go of the gold. Let go of the curse." Erwin looked at the outstretched hand, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of his decision. He could feel the curse of the golden touch still coursing through him, and it was suffocating. His kingdom was gone. His people were gone. All that remained was a pile of gold that could never bring him the one thing he truly desired: redemption. With a final shuddering breath, he placed his golden hand in the stranger's. The moment their skin touched, the palace began to shake. The gold that had once consumed everything began to melt away, flowing like liquid into the cracks in the stone, pooling at the feet of the king. The curse was lifting, but the price was steep. Erwin fell to his knees, his golden form beginning to wither. The light from the stranger's hand grew brighter, blinding him for a moment. When the light faded, the palace was silent once more. King Erwin was no more. In his place stood a man, broken and empty, surrounded by the remnants of a kingdom that could never be restored. The stranger was gone, leaving only the echoes of their words behind. The rebels, led by Leora, stormed the palace. They found the throne room empty, save for the gold that had melted into the floor. And though they had come to seek justice, they found none, only the remnants of a once great empire, crumbling to dust. A new era had begun in Aurum, but it was a harsh one. The scars of the past would take generations to heal, and the memory of King Erwin's greed would linger like a shadow over the land. But the people, now free from the curse of gold, began the slow process of rebuilding. And as for King Erwin, his story became a dark fairy tale, a cautionary tale passed down through the generations, a reminder that even the greatest of kings can fall when they seek to control what is beyond their grasp. The greedy king's doom was a lesson for all who would listen, that the pursuit of gold and power, unchecked and unbalanced, could bring ruin not only to a kingdom, but to the very soul of the one who sought it.